The Roaring Twenties, Part 1. The Impact of World War One. An overview. After World War One, Americans stopped caring about reform as much as they had at the start of the century. Americans wanted to forget the war and enjoy the new prosperity. The U.S. government went back to the laissez-faire system of economics, and in the 1920s, the U.S. enjoyed a great time of prosperity. Some background. In the early 1920s, and especially in 1920, Harding defeated his Democratic opponent and marked the start of post-war conservatism. The impact of the war: women, African Americans, and ethnic minorities. Women post-war were reluctant to go back into their pre-war status. That led to an increase in protests for the right to vote. African Americans post-war were unwilling to be treated as second-class citizens. There was an increase in confrontations between black and whites, especially in southern cities, and there was an especially big confrontation in Tulsa where whites tore apart and destroyed a black community over just an accusation. And in the 1920s, it was a hard time for ethnic minorities. Eastern Europeans were being accused of being communists, and Asian Americans still faced discrimination as whites feared their increasing population in the West Coast. The Great Migration. The Great Migration was when Southern blacks moved to northern cities from 1910 to 1930. There were some push-pull factors for the Great Migration. A push factor was the brutality of Jim Crow laws in the South that increased after the war. And there was also many lynchings in the South. A pull factor was the promise of steady jobs in northern factories. Many whites in the North felt threatened by the Great Migration, which led to riots and segregation in northern cities. The 20s. An overview. Society and the economy was undergoing many changes. This was a great time of prosperity for whites and middle-class Americans. Harding at the start of the 20s promised to return the U.S. to normalcy before the war and before Wilson's progressive reforms. The government did little to regulate business, and Harding chose to follow the path of the presidents of the 80s and 90s. The 20s, post-war recession. Background: during the war, prices of goods increased without wages increasing, which led to post-war, we stopped producing mass amounts of exports, which then led to unemployment went up by 10% by 1921. Unemployment plus high prices plus declining farm prices led to an economic recession during the first 2 years of the 20s. The Harding scandal to prosperity under Coolidge. The Harding presidency was marked by the Teapot Dome scandal. The Teapot Dome scandal was a scandal where one of Harding's government officials, Albert Fall, leased federally owned land with a huge oil reserve to several oil companies. Harding knew nothing about the bribes, but he still took responsibility as he had not hired trustworthy officials. Harding actually died right before Congress could investigate further into the situation, so Vice President Coolidge became president and also won the next election. Coolidge liked to support big business rather than regulating them. He favored high tariffs to protect U.S. business and also favored lower taxes. The Republican Party was now seen as more of a supporter of big business than farmers and workers. The 20s. Farmer and minorities in trouble. An overview. In the midst of the prosperity of the 20s, people in rural areas and some cities were facing hard times. The laissez-faire system of economics hurt farmers and low-wage workers. Farmers faced falling prices post-war. That led to banks often foreclosing their farms since the farmers could not pay back their loans. Low-wage workers in urban areas, who were often minorities, also suffered since the government no longer actively tried to help their working and living conditions. In essence, the progressive era had come to an end. And also, labor unions lost a lot of powers and their strikes were ineffective. The 20s. Entertainment and cultural homogenization. By 1920, entertainment was revolutionized. There was phonographs and radio broadcasting shows. The movie industry found its home in Hollywood. And all these new widespread forms of entertainment created a common American culture throughout the nation. People all across the nation saw the same movies, adored the same celebrities, etc. Repetitive ads also certified the common culture. Some Americans were actually afraid that the various regions of the U.S. might lose their uniqueness.